Theme 4: The subject matter of literary translation theory and its nature. The subject matter of literary translation theory. The theory of translation is subdivided into general theory, dealing with the general characteristics of translation, regardless of its type, and special branches, concerned with the theoretical description and analysis of various types of translation, such as translation of fiction, poetry, technical, and scientific literature, official documents, etc. The general theory of translation has a clearly defined subject matter. The process of translating in it entirely, including its results, with due regard to all the factors affecting it. Each special branch deepens and specifies the general theory in order to reflect what is common to all types and varieties of translation, while the special branches are mainly concerned with the specific features of each genre. The subject matter of literary translation theory is the process of translating literary works from one language into another. Since literary work is considered to be a special type of text, it requires special approach. So the use of generally known methods in literary translation process is different, and all this is the concern of literary translation theory. The nature of literary translation. Translation may be viewed as an interlingual communicative act in which at least three participants are involved: the sender of source, the author of the source language message, the translator, who acts in dual capacity as the receptor of the source language message and as the sender of the equivalent target language message, and the receiver of the target language message, which is the translation. If the original was not intended for a foreign language receiver, there is one more participant, the source language receiver, for whom the message was originally produced. Translation, as such, consists in producing a text message in the target language equivalent to the original text message in the source language. Translation as an interlingual communicative act includes two phases: communication between the sender and the translator, and communication between the translator and the receiver of the newly produced target language text. In the first phase, the translator, acting as a source language receiver, analyzes the original message, extracting the information contained in it. Literary translation theory is an interdisciplinary area, predominantly linguistic, but also allied to psychology, sociology, ethnography, and area studies. It is based on the application of linguistic theory to a specific type of speech behavior, that is, translation. As Snell Hornby says, translation is a cross-cultural event. It is part of cross-cultural communication. And communication is an event in which people share their world of thought with others. Therefore, the value of translation is embedded in the explanation theory of communication that focuses on how people share thoughts with one another. It differs from contrastive linguistics, the main aim of which is to compare different language systems in order to determine the similarities and distinctive features While literary translation theory has a subject matter of its own, the process of translation, and uses the data of contrastive linguistics merely as a starting point. Though literary works were translated from one language into another even before Christ until the 20th century, there were only some articles written on literary translation theory. So one can't assume that the history of literary translation has been studied thoroughly. As the translation invariant with the branch of translation theory, one can call the feelings and emotions aroused by the source language text, and that should be expressed by the target text. The effect of the translator's point of view. Another pragmatic factor which deals with translation is the socio-psychological and ideological orientation of the translator himself. As far back in 1936, Chukovsky wrote that every translator himself, that is, deliberately or inadvertently, reflects his class affiliations. And in doing so, he does not necessarily set himself the task of falsify the original. This view may be somewhat oversimplified, but it is true that although ideally the translator should identify himself with the author, this is not always the case. What is more, sometimes it is impossible. Therefore, classics are retranslated in each generation because each generation rereads them in its own orientation. Chukovsky cites an intrusive example in translating Shakespeare's Coriolanus. The Russian translator Druzhin tried to reproduce the original as accurately as possible, yet they inadvertently adapted the tragedy to his own point of view of a liberal opposed to the revolutionary Raznochinцы of the 1860s. Linguistic and extra-linguistic aspects of translation. However, the information conveyed by linguistic science alone, that is, the meanings expressed in the text, would not be sufficient for adequate translation. Some linguists distinguish between what they call translation, based solely on the meanings expressed by linguistic science, and interpretation, involving recourse to extra-linguistic information. In fact, these two are very closely intertwined, and in most cases, effective translation is impossible without adequate knowledge of the speech act situation and the situation described in the text. The phrase two on the aisle, два места ближе к проходу, would hardly make much sense unless it is known that the conversation takes place at a box office. This is the speech act situation. Non-uniqueness of translators' decisions. Translation is the process determined by quite a number of factors. In addition to conveying the semantic information contained in the text, the denotational meanings, and emotive stylistic connotations, the translator has to take into account the author's communicative intent, the type of the audience for which the message is intended, its socio-psychological characteristics, and background knowledge. The process is governed by so many variables cannot have a single outcome. What is more, the synonymic and paraphrasing potential of the language is so high that there may be several ways of describing the same extra-linguistic situation. And even though they may not be quite identical, the differences may be neutralized by the context. It should also be remembered that the translator's decision may vary depending on the receiver. The translation of realia for specialists and for laymen, and the purpose of translation. Compare the old and modernized version of the Bible. A woman who had an evil spirit in her that had kept her sick for 18 years, and a woman who for 18 years had been ill for some psychological cause. To compare also the poetic translation of Shakespeare by Pasternak and the scholarly translation by Professor Morozov. The problem of translatability. Conflicting views have been expressed by linguists concerning the problem of translatability, ranging from an entirely negative stand, typical of Humboldt, who considered each language the embodiment of national spirit and the nation's view of the world, and therefore regarded translation as an impossible task, to an unqualified positive attitude found in many contemporary writings in translation. The very fact that translation makes interlingual communication possible is an argument in favor of translatability. Yet it is an oversimplification to claim that every meaningful element of the text is translatable. In his preface to The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain says that he had reproduced the book painstakingly and with the support of personal familiarity, the shadings of a number of dialects, for example, the Missouri Negro dialect, etc. Naturally, none of these fine distinctions can be reflected in the translation. Yet, by using low colloquial and substandard forms, the translator can give an adequate impression of the character's social and educational status, and will thus render the most essential functional characteristics of those dialectal features. As compared to the untranslatable elements, as compared to the semantic and functional properties of the text, which are perfectly translatable, the elements which are untranslatable are marginal and relatively unimportant. Besides, as we shall show later on, most of the losses can be compensated for to some extent. Therefore, we may speak of sufficient or adequate, though not necessarily complete translatability, to permit effective interlingual communication and satisfactory rendering of communicatively relevant information. In producing the target language text, the translator changes its plan of expression, which is a linguistic form, while its plan of content, which is the meaning, should remain unchanged. In fact, an equivalent target language message should match the original in the plane of content. The message produced by the translator should evoke practically the same response in the target language receiver as the original message in the source language receiver. That means, above all, that whatever the text says and whatever it implies, it should be understood in the same way by both the source language user, for whom it was originally intended, and by the target language user. It is therefore the translator's duty, originally intended. And by the target language user, for whom it was should be understood in the same way by both the source language user, for whom it was intended, and by the target language user. It is therefore the translator's duty to make available to the target language receiver the maximum amount of information covered by linguistic science, including both the denotational and referential meanings, that is, the information about the actual linguistic reality which they denote, and their emotive stylistic connotations.